Every parent makes sacrifices for their children. They work long hours to provide food and shelter. They sacrifice sleep to comfort nightmares. They give up dreams to ensure their children have opportunities they never had. It's a relationship built on an unspoken contract. Parents protect and nurture, and children grow into adults who carry forward the values and love they received. But what happens when that fundamental bond is not just broken, but destroyed in the most violent way imaginable? The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 2018. The voice on the other end was calm, eerily so, belonging to a 14-year-old boy whose words would send shockwaves through the quiet community of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. "I need to report a crime," the voice said, steady and clear. "My parents are dead. I killed them." The dispatcher, trained to handle emergency calls with professional detachment, found herself momentarily speechless. "Can you repeat that, please?" "My parents are dead. I shot them both. I'm sitting in the living room right now. They're upstairs in their bedroom. You should probably send someone." When police arrived at the affluent neighborhood on the outskirts of Tulsa, they found Tyler Bennett sitting on the front porch steps, hands resting calmly on his knees, waiting. Inside the sprawling two-story home, they discovered the bodies of Michael and Sarah Bennett, both shot multiple times while they slept in their bed. The murder weapon, a Glock 17 handgun belonging to Michael Bennett, lay on the nightstand where Tyler had carefully placed it after the shootings. But this wasn't a case of a troubled teen finally snapping under pressure. This wasn't a story of abuse or neglect that drove a child to desperation. As investigators dug deeper into the Bennett family's life, they uncovered something far more disturbing. A seemingly perfect family destroyed by a child who showed no remorse, offered no real explanation, and left everyone asking the same haunting question: why? The courtroom was packed 9 months later when Judge Patricia Hawkins prepared to deliver Tyler's sentence. The 14-year-old, now 15, stood before her in a dress shirt and tie that made him look even younger than his age. Behind him sat his maternal grandparents, torn between grief for their daughter and some desperate, irrational hope that their grandson might somehow be saved. Across the aisle sat Michael Bennett's family, their faces hard with anger and demands for justice. "Tyler Bennett," Judge Hawkins began, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to pronounce. "You have been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The victims were your own parents, people who by all accounts loved you, provided for you, and gave you every advantage. And yet, you executed them while they slept, showed no remorse, and have offered no explanation that approaches adequacy for what you've done." She paused, looking directly at the teenager whose face remained impassive, unreadable. "The sentence I am about to deliver will determine the rest of your life, but before I pronounce it, I want you to understand something." The judge's words hung in the air as everyone in that courtroom leaned forward, waiting to hear not just the sentence, but some explanation for how a child could become a killer. What they would learn over the course of this trial would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, adolescence, and the darkness that can hide behind even the most ordinary-seeming teenage face. This is the story of Tyler Bennett and the night he murdered his parents in cold blood. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma sits just southeast of Tulsa, a community that prides itself on traditional values, excellent schools, and the kind of neighborhood safety that allows children to ride bikes until streetlights come on. The town's motto, "Opportunity for a Bright Future," captures the optimistic, forward-looking spirit of a place where families move seeking good schools, low crime, and a wholesome environment for raising children. It was exactly the kind of community where the Bennetts seemed to fit perfectly, where their story of hard work and success embodied everything Broken Arrow represented. Michael Bennett, 42 years old in October 2018, had built an impressive career as a petroleum engineer for one of Tulsa's major oil and gas companies. Originally from a working-class family in Ohio, Michael had put himself through college at Oklahoma State University, graduating with honors in petroleum engineering and immediately securing a position that would become the foundation of a lucrative career. Colleagues described him as brilliant but approachable, demanding but fair, someone who commanded respect through competence rather than authority. His rise through the company had been steady and impressive, earning him a senior engineering position with a salary that placed the Bennett family firmly in the upper middle class. Sarah Bennett, 39 years old in October 2018, had met Michael during their college years at Oklahoma State. She had been studying elementary education, dreaming of a career teaching young children and making a difference in their early developmental years. After their marriage in 2001, Sarah had taught second grade at an elementary school in Tulsa for several years, earning a reputation as a patient, creative teacher who genuinely loved her students. When Tyler was born in 2004, Sarah had made the decision to become a stay-at-home mother, at least temporarily, wanting to be fully present for his son's early years. That temporary break from teaching had stretched into permanent retirement from the profession, as Sarah found fulfillment in managing their household, volunteering at Tyler schools, and engaging in community activities. The Bennett home on Aspen Creek Drive reflected their success and status. The two-story colonial-style house, purchased in 2010 when Tyler was 6 years old, sat on a meticulously landscaped lot in one of Broken Arrow's most desirable neighborhoods. The house featured 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and a finished basement that Michael had converted into a home theater and game room for Tyler. The backyard included a pool, a covered patio with an outdoor kitchen, and enough space for the elaborate birthday parties and family gatherings that Sarah loved to host. To their neighbors, to their friends at St. Mark's Episcopal Church where they attended services most Sundays, to the parents of Tyler's classmates, the Bennetts appeared to be living the American dream. They were attractive, successful, involved in their community, and devoted to their only child. Michael coached Tyler's Little League team for several years. Sarah volunteered in the school library and organized fundraisers for various causes. They took family vacations to Disney World, to ski resorts in Colorado, to beaches in Florida. Their Facebook pages, which would later be scrutinized by investigators and media alike, showed a catalog of smiling family photos, celebratory posts about Tyler's achievements, and the comfortable documentation of a life well lived. Teachers from Tyler's elementary years described him as intelligent but quiet, a student who performed well academically without being particularly engaged or enthusiastic. He completed his work competently, caused no behavioral problems, and interacted appropriately, if somewhat distantly, with classmates. His second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Morrison, would later tell investigators that Tyler had been perfectly pleasant but oddly unmemorable, a child who moved through her classroom without leaving much impression, despite spending an entire school year under her instruction. "He wasn't troubled in any way I could identify," Mrs. Morrison recalled during a post-arrest interview. "He wasn't the most social child, but he wasn't isolated either. He had friends, or at least acquaintances. He participated in group activities when required. His work was always neat and complete. If you had asked me to predict which of my students might someday commit a violent crime, Tyler Bennett would have been the absolute last one I would have chosen. He was just normal. Perhaps too normal, if that makes sense." As Tyler entered middle school, that sense of being too normal began to manifest in ways that, in retrospect, seemed significant, but at the time appeared to be typical adolescent development. He became more withdrawn, spending increasing amounts of time in his room, engaging less with family activities, responding to his parents' questions with one-word answers or shrugs.
Sarah Bennett mentioned these changes to her friends and to Tyler's school counselor, concerned that her son was pulling away from her, but she was repeatedly assured that this was typical teenage behavior, that adolescents naturally sought independence and privacy as part of their developmental journey toward adulthood. What Sarah didn't know, what no one knew until after the murders, was what Tyler was doing during those long hours alone in his room. Forensic examination of his computer and phone would reveal a deeply disturbing pattern of Internet activity that had been carefully hidden using VPNs, encrypted browsers, and deleted browsing history that Tyler had thought was permanently erased, but which could be recovered by specialists. His online activity showed an obsessive fascination with violence, particularly familial violence, that dated back years before the murders he would eventually commit. Starting around age 11, Tyler's search history showed queries about famous family murders, the Menendez brothers, who killed their parents in 1989, Dipendra of Nepal, who murdered 9 members of his family in 2001, and numerous less famous cases of parricide that he had researched in detail. He had visited online forums where people discussed true crime cases, sometimes posting under anonymous usernames to ask specific questions about how these killers were caught, what mistakes they had made, and what sentences they had received. He had watched countless hours of crime documentaries, particularly those focusing on juvenile killers, and had bookmarked articles about the psychological evaluations and legal proceedings in such cases. More disturbing were searches that suggested Tyler was not merely interested in these cases as entertainment or morbid curiosity, but was actively researching them as case studies for planning his own actions. In the 6 months before the murders, his searches became increasingly specific and practical. How to shoot someone so they die instantly? Do people wake up when shot? How long does it take police to respond to 911 calls in Broken Arrow? Can forensics tell when someone was shot? And most chillingly, best way to kill parents while sleeping. Tyler's bedroom, when searched by investigators after his arrest, revealed another layer to the child his parents thought they knew. On the surface, it appeared to be a typical teenage boy's room. Posters of sports teams and musicians on the walls, video game consoles connected to a large TV, a desk cluttered with school supplies and personal electronics. But hidden in places Sarah Bennett clearly had never looked while respecting her son's privacy, investigators found a journal that would become crucial evidence in understanding Tyler's state of mind leading up to the murders. The journal, a standard composition notebook with a black cover that Tyler had labeled "Private, Do Not Read" in bold letters, contained entries dating back approximately 2 years. Early entries were mundane observations about school, complaints about homework, and typical teenage frustrations with parental rules and restrictions. But as the entries progressed, they revealed a progressive darkening of Tyler's thoughts and an increasing fixation on his parents as obstacles to some undefined freedom or authentic life he believed he deserved. An entry from January 2018, 10 months before the murders, read, "Sometimes I imagine what life would be like if they weren't here. Not in a sad way, like if they died in an accident, but just if they didn't exist. I think about having the house to myself, doing what I want, not having to pretend to be interested in their boring conversations or fake smile when they give me things I didn't ask for. Would anyone even notice if they were gone? Would I miss them, or would I just feel relief?" A March 2018 entry was more explicit. "I read about a kid in Florida who killed his parents and then lived in the house for 3 days before calling police. He said he did it because they were going to send him to military school. At least he had a reason. I don't even have that. I just want them gone. Is that normal? Probably not. I don't care." The final entry, written on October 14, 2018, just 1 day before the murders, contained words that would be read aloud in court and debated by experts trying to understand Tyler's mindset. "Tomorrow is the day. I've decided. I'm tired of waiting for something to change. They're never going to change, and I'm never going to be who they want me to be, so what's the point? It's better this way, cleaner. I've planned it all out. I know exactly what to do. By this time tomorrow, it will be over, and I'll finally be free. I'm not scared. I'm not sad. I just want it to be done. This premeditation, documented in Tyler's own handwriting, would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case for first-degree murder. But the journal entries also raised profound questions about Tyler's psychological state and whether a 14-year-old could truly understand the finality and consequences of what he was planning. Defense experts would later argue that the journal showed not adult-like calculation, but rather adolescent fantasy and magical thinking, a child's inability to fully grasp that freedom through murder would result not in the idealized independent life he imagined, but in prison and the loss of any real freedom whatsoever. Tyler's relationship with his parents, as reconstructed through interviews with extended family, friends, and school personnel, appeared from the outside to be positive and healthy, if perhaps slightly distant. Michael Bennett, working long hours and traveling occasionally for his job, had less day-to-day interaction with Tyler than Sarah did. But he made efforts to maintain connection through their shared interest in baseball and through weekend activities when his work schedule permitted. He attended Tyler's games, helped with homework when asked, and took his son on annual father-son camping trips that Sarah had instituted as a way to ensure they maintained their bond. Michael was a good father, his brother David Bennett would later testify. Was he perfect? No. He worked a lot, and sometimes that meant he wasn't as present as maybe he should have been. But he loved Tyler. He was proud of Tyler. He talked about his son constantly, showed me pictures, bragged about his grades and his baseball skills. The idea that Tyler could have felt neglected or unloved is just incomprehensible to everyone who knew Michael. Sarah Bennett's relationship with Tyler appeared, if anything, to be too close for comfort during his adolescent years, according to some observers. She had structured her entire life around her son, volunteering at his schools, attending every game and performance, involving herself deeply in his activities and social life. Some of Tyler's middle school classmates would later describe her as a helicopter parent, someone who was always around, always checking in, always trying to insert herself into situations where most teenagers wanted independence and space. Tyler's mom was really nice, but she was like always there, one classmate told investigators after the murders. She'd show up at school to have lunch with him, even in 8th grade, when most kids would be mortified by that. She'd friend his friends on Facebook and comment on everything. Tyler never said she bothered him, but you could tell he was kind of embarrassed sometimes. But he was always polite to her, always said thank you when she brought him something or came to pick him up. He seemed like a good kid who loved his mom. This public image of polite affection masked whatever Tyler was truly feeling, and even after extensive investigation, the true nature of his relationship with his parents remained somewhat opaque. He had never reported abuse to school counselors, teachers, coaches, or friends. He had never run away from home, never made threats against his parents, never displayed the kind of obvious warning signs that might have predicted violence. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, well-behaved teenager who kept his thoughts and feelings largely to himself, performing the role of dutiful son while internally moving toward a decision that would destroy his family. The Bennett family's last normal day together was October 14, 2018, a Sunday that followed the familiar patterns of their weekend routine. They attended the 10 a.m. service at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, sitting in their usual pew near the front where Sarah liked to be positioned. Tyler wore khakis and a button-down shirt that Sarah had laid out for him, and he participated in the service appropriately, standing and kneeling at the correct times, mouthing the responses to prayers, presenting to the congregation exactly what they expected to see, a nice family with a well-mannered teenage son. After church, they went to brunch at the Stonegate Grill, an upscale restaurant where the Bennetts often ate Sunday meals. They ordered their typical dishes. Sarah always got the salmon, Michael usually chose steak, and Tyler varied between burgers and pasta. The waitress who served them that day, Melissa Rodriguez, would later tell investigators that the family seemed completely normal, pleasant, nothing unusual at all. She remembered that Tyler had been quiet but had smiled when she brought his food, that Michael had joked with her about the Sooners football game that weekend, that Sarah had asked about the waitress's daughter who was the same age as Tyler and attended the same school. If you had told me that one of those three people would be dead within 24 hours, I would have never believed you. And if you'd told me that the quiet boy eating a burger would be the one who killed the other two, I would have said you were insane. They seemed happy. They seemed like a family. That afternoon, Tyler spent several hours in his room, ostensibly doing homework, but actually finalizing his plans and writing that final journal entry that documented his intent to kill his parents the following day. Sarah knocked on his door around 4 p.m. to ask if he wanted to watch a movie with them, a Sunday afternoon tradition they had maintained throughout his childhood. Tyler declined, saying he had a lot of homework to finish, and Sarah, respecting his need to focus on his studies, left him alone.
Michael spent the afternoon watching football, calling out occasionally to ask Tyler if he wanted to join him, never getting more than a no thanks in response. Around 6 p.m., Sarah prepared dinner, pot roast with vegetables, a family favorite, and called both her husband and son to the dining room. They ate together at the formal dining room table, Sarah trying to engage Tyler in conversation about school and his upcoming week, Tyler responding with polite but minimal answers, Michael checking his phone periodically for work emails, despite Sarah's repeated requests that phones not be present at family meals. "How's baseball practice going?" Michael asked his son at one point during dinner, attempting to connect over their shared interest. "Fine," Tyler responded, not looking up from his plate. "Coach mentioned you've been working on your curveball. Said it's looking good." "Yeah. Maybe we can practice in the backyard next weekend if the weather holds." "Sure." This conversation, or lack thereof, was typical of their recent interactions, according to Michael's brother David, who had occasionally been present for family dinners. Tyler was not hostile or rude, just withdrawn and uncommunicative, giving his parents the minimum responses required to avoid conflict or further questioning. Neither Michael nor Sarah seemed particularly concerned by this dynamic, chalking it up to normal teenage behavior and trusting that Tyler would become more communicative again as he matured out of adolescence. After dinner, Tyler helped his mother clear the table without being asked, a gesture of consideration that Sarah would remember later with heartbreaking confusion. He had been polite, helpful, showing her the kind of attention and care that made her think they were in a good place, that whatever distance had grown between them over the past year might be closing. She had even mentioned to Michael that night as they were getting ready for bed that Tyler had seemed more like himself lately, more engaged. "Maybe he's coming out of that teenage funk," Sarah had said, hopefully, not knowing that her son's improved mood came not from reconnection with his family, but from the decision he had made to end their lives. Tyler had spent the evening in his room, door closed, music playing softly, maintaining the appearance of normal teenage behavior while mentally preparing himself for what he would do once his parents were asleep. He played video games for a while, checked social media, responded to a few text messages from classmates about an upcoming school project. Everything about his evening was ordinary, routine, unremarkable, except the fact that he was counting down the hours until he would become a killer. Around 11:30 p.m., Tyler's parents went to bed, following their usual weeknight routine. Michael set his alarm for 6 a.m., checked that the doors were locked,
and climbed into bed beside Sarah. They talked briefly about their plans for the week, about Michael's upcoming business trip to Houston, about Tyler's progress in school. Then they turned out the lights, settled into sleep, and never woke up. The Bennett home on Aspen Creek Drive sat quiet under a clear October sky, the kind of peaceful suburban night where the only sounds were distant dogs barking and the occasional car passing on nearby streets. Inside the house, Michael and Sarah Bennett slept in their master bedroom on the second floor, unaware that their son was moving through the darkened house with lethal intent. Tyler Bennett, 14 years old and small for his age, stood at the bottom of the staircase that led to his parents' bedroom, his heart rate elevated but his hand steady, his mind focused on the task he had been planning for months. The first step in Tyler's plan was to retrieve the murder weapon. Michael Bennett, despite having a teenage son in the house, kept a Glock 17 handgun in a biometric safe in his home office, a room on the first floor that Michael used for work-from-home days and personal business. The safe was supposed to be accessible only to Michael, programmed to open with his fingerprint, a security measure that Michael believed ensured Tyler could never access the weapon even if he discovered where it was kept. What Michael didn't know was that Tyler had observed the safe's location years earlier and had been researching biometric safe vulnerabilities online for months. Tyler's internet search history, later recovered by forensic analysts, showed that he had learned it was possible to bypass certain biometric safes using simple household items and techniques widely shared on online forums. More importantly, he had discovered that many people, including his father, registered backup fingerprints for their biometric safes in case their primary finger was injured. Michael had registered both his right and left index fingers to the safe, and on one occasion when Tyler was 12 years old, Michael had allowed Tyler to place his own fingerprint in the system as well, thinking it might be necessary in an emergency situation where Tyler needed to access important documents if something happened to both parents. This decision, made casually years earlier with the best of intentions, had given Tyler the access he needed. On the night of October 15, 2018, at approximately 11:35 p.m., Tyler entered his father's office, approached the biometric safe mounted on the wall behind the desk, and placed his right index finger on the scanner. The safe opened with a soft electronic beep, revealing the Glock 17 handgun and 2 fully loaded magazines. Tyler removed the gun, checked that a magazine was already inserted, as his research had taught him to do, and chambered a round by pulling back the slide. Tyler's familiarity with the gun's operation came from 2 sources: online research and the single time his father had taken him to a shooting range when Tyler was 13 years old, hoping to teach his son gun safety and perhaps start a new shared hobby. That trip to the range had been uncomfortable for both of them, with Tyler showing little interest or enthusiasm, and Michael had never repeated the outing, assuming his son simply wasn't interested in firearms. What Michael had failed to notice was that Tyler had paid careful attention to every aspect of how the gun worked, asking questions that seemed like mere curiosity, but were actually information gathering for future use. Gun in hand, Tyler stood in his father's office for several moments, breathing steadily, running through the plan one final time in his mind. According to his later confession, he felt calm and focused, with no second thoughts or emotional turmoil about what he was preparing to do. This lack of anxiety or hesitation would later become a significant point of discussion among forensic psychologists evaluating Tyler, as most people, even those intent on committing violence, experience significant stress responses when about to take human life, particularly the life of someone they know and love. Tyler climbed the stairs to the second floor, moving quietly across the hardwood floors, careful to avoid the spots he knew creaked. His parents' bedroom door was closed but not locked, as it never was. The Bennetts had maintained an open-door policy throughout Tyler's childhood, wanting him to feel comfortable coming to them if he needed them during the night, never imagining that this accessibility would facilitate their murder. Tyler turned the handle slowly, pushed the door open, and stepped into his parents' bedroom. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of Michael's phone charging on his nightstand and the digital display of Sarah's alarm clock on her side of the bed. Tyler's eyes, already adjusted to darkness from moving through the house with lights off, could clearly see his parents' forms in the king-sized bed. Michael slept on the right side of the bed, closer to the door, lying on his side facing away from the entrance. Sarah slept on the left, on her back, one arm draped across her husband's side, the position she had fallen asleep in countless times during their marriage. Tyler approached his father's side of the bed first, raising the Glock with both hands in the grip he had practiced after watching countless YouTube videos about proper shooting stance and technique. He pointed the gun at the back of his father's head from a distance of approximately 2 feet, close enough that missing would be virtually impossible. According to his confession, Tyler stood in that position for nearly a minute, gun aimed, finger on the trigger, making his final decision about whether to proceed. And then, with no audible warning, no final words or explanation, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot in the confined space of the bedroom was deafening, though Tyler, who had inserted foam earplugs before entering the room, was partially protected from the acoustic trauma. Michael Bennett died instantly, the bullet entering the back of his skull and causing catastrophic brain damage that ended his life before his nervous system could register pain or consciousness could register what was happening. His body convulsed briefly, an involuntary response to brain death, and then went still. Sarah Bennett, sleeping beside her husband, woke immediately at the sound of the gunshot, sitting up in bed in confusion and terror. What happened in the next few seconds would haunt everyone who later heard Tyler's clinical description of the events. Sarah, disoriented and not immediately understanding what had woken her or what the spreading warmth beside her was, turned toward the sound of movement in her room. She saw her son standing beside the bed, illuminated by the nightstand light that had automatically activated with her movement. She saw the gun in his hands. She saw her husband's still form beside her. And in that moment of horrifying clarity, she understood what was happening. "Tyler," she said, her voice captured in his memory and later relayed in his confession with disturbing precision. "Tyler, what did you do? Oh, God, what did you do?"
Sarah Bennett's final moments, as reconstructed from Tyler's account and forensic evidence, showed a mother's instinct overriding self-preservation. Rather than screaming, rather than running, rather than immediately trying to save herself, her first response was concern for her son, horror at what he had done to himself as much as what he had done to his father. She reached out her hand toward Tyler, not defensively but imploringly, as if she could somehow undo what had just happened, as if maternal love could pull her son back from the precipice he had already leaped from. "Tyler, please," she said, according to his confession. "Tyler, we can fix this. Put the gun down. We can help you. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it." But there was no fixing it. Tyler, having crossed the point of no return by killing his father, understood that letting his mother live meant immediate arrest, meant his plan failing, meant facing consequences he had not adequately considered despite all his research and planning. He raised the gun again, pointed it at his mother's chest from across the bed, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first bullet struck Sarah in the chest, puncturing her right lung. The second hit her in the abdomen. The third, fired as she fell backward onto the bed, struck her in the throat. Sarah Bennett did not die instantly as her husband had. The medical examiner would later determine that she survived for several minutes after being shot, conscious for at least some of that time, bleeding internally and externally, her body going into shock. Tyler stood beside the bed, watching his mother die, listening to her labored breathing,
observing as her eyes remained open but unfocused, as her body trembled and then gradually went still. He later told investigators that he felt he needed to make sure she was dead before proceeding with the next phase of his plan, so he waited, gun still in hand, until he was certain both parents had no pulse. The entire sequence, from Tyler entering his parents' bedroom to confirming both deaths, took approximately 6 to 7 minutes, according to his later reconstruction of events. He stood in that bedroom, surrounded by the consequences of what he had done, his parents' bodies cooling on the bed where they had slept and loved and dreamed of their son's future, and according to his confession, he felt relieved that it was over and ready to move on to the next part. The next part of Tyler's plan, as he had outlined it in his journal and refined through his online research, was to stage the scene to his advantage and then call police. He had initially considered trying to stage a home invasion or other false scenario that might deflect suspicion from himself, but his research into similar cases had convinced him that such efforts typically failed and actually made suspects look more guilty. Instead, he had decided on a different approach: immediate confession, cooperation with police, and reliance on his age and supposed mental health issues to minimize his punishment. Tyler returned to his bedroom, changed out of the clothes he had been wearing into fresh pajamas, and placed the worn clothes into a plastic bag which he hid in his closet. He washed his hands and face in his bathroom, removing gunshot residue and blood spatter, though he was not thorough enough to eliminate all forensic evidence, which would later confirm his proximity to the shootings. Then he went downstairs to the living room, sat on the couch in the darkened space, and using his cell phone, dialed 911 at exactly 11:47 p.m. The 911 call, which would later be played repeatedly in court and analyzed by experts, began with Tyler's calm statement, "I need to report a crime. My parents are dead. I killed them." The dispatcher, Jennifer Walsh, a 10-year veteran of emergency services who had handled countless crisis calls, was momentarily speechless at the direct confession delivered in such an eerily calm tone. "Can you repeat that, please?" she asked, following protocol, to confirm information even as she was already flagging the call as a possible homicide and alerting police dispatch. "My parents are dead," Tyler repeated with the same flat affect. "I shot them both. I'm sitting in the living room right now. They're upstairs in their bedroom. You should probably send someone." Walsh, maintaining her professional composure despite the disturbing nature of the call, began asking the standard questions required for such situations. Was anyone else in the house? Was the caller injured? Where was the weapon? Was there any immediate danger? Tyler answered each question cooperatively and clearly. He was alone in the house. He was not injured. The gun was upstairs next to the bodies, and there was no danger as long as police didn't try to hurt him when they arrived. "Tyler, that's your name, right? Tyler Bennett?" "Yes." "Tyler, I need you to stay on the line with me until officers arrive. Can you do that?" "I can do that." "Are you feeling okay? Are you hurt at all? Are you thinking about hurting yourself?" "No," Tyler responded, his voice still unnaturally calm. "I'm fine. I just want this to be over with." The conversation continued for another 8 minutes as police were dispatched to the scene, with Walsh trying to keep Tyler engaged and assess his mental state, while also gathering information that would be crucial for responding officers. Tyler's tone throughout never wavered from calm and cooperative, showing none of the hysteria, panic, or emotional distress that typically characterizes 911 calls related to violence, even from perpetrators who have acted in self-defense or under extreme duress. This unusual composure would later be cited as evidence of premeditation and lack of remorse by prosecutors, while defense psychologists would argue it indicated dissociation or psychotic detachment. At 12:03 a.m., just 7 minutes after Tyler's call, the first police units arrived at the Bennett home on Aspen Creek Drive. Officers Jacob Morrison and Katie Fernandez approached the house cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure exactly what situation they were entering, despite Tyler's calm assurances on the phone. They found Tyler sitting on the front porch steps, hands visible and resting on his knees, exactly as he had told the 911 dispatcher he would be. The 14-year-old looked up as officers approached, illuminated by their flashlights, and said simply, "I'm Tyler Bennett. I called. My parents are upstairs." Officer Morrison approached Tyler, while Officer Fernandez maintained a defensive position, and he cuffed Tyler without incident, the teenager offering no resistance and continuing to cooperate fully. As additional units arrived, including supervisors and detectives from the Broken Arrow Police Department, Tyler was placed in the back of a police car while officers secured the scene and prepared to enter the house. He sat in the back seat, according to the officers watching him, staring straight ahead with an expression they described as blank or distant, showing no anxiety, no tears, no visible emotion at all. Detective Sean Murphy, a 19-year veteran of the Broken Arrow Police Department and the on-call detective for homicides that night, arrived at 12:03 a.m. After a brief consultation with the patrol officers at the scene, Murphy made entry into the Bennett home, accompanied by Officer Morrison and another patrol officer. They cleared the first floor methodically, finding no one else present, and then ascended the stairs to the master bedroom that Tyler had indicated as the location of the bodies. What Murphy found in that bedroom would stay with him for the rest of his career, joining the collection of images that haunt those who investigate violent crimes. Michael and Sarah Bennett lay in their bed, Michael on his side with the back of his head destroyed by the close-range gunshot, Sarah on her back with 3 visible gunshot wounds and blood soaking through the bedding and mattress beneath her. The gun, as Tyler had indicated, lay on the nightstand on Michael's side, placed there carefully rather than dropped in panic or haste. The scene showed no signs of struggle beyond Sarah's final moments, no overturned furniture, no defensive chaos. It was a sterile, efficient double murder.
Executed with a calmness that seemed impossible for someone so young. Detective Murphy immediately radioed for the medical examiner and crime scene investigation unit, then returned downstairs to prevent any contamination of the scene. The house was officially declared a crime scene, with yellow tape stretched across the property and additional officers called in to maintain the perimeter and manage the growing number of neighbors who had begun emerging from their homes, drawn by the police presence and the disturbing rumors already spreading through the quiet community. "We need to transport the suspect to the station for questioning," Murphy told the officers, securing Tyler in the patrol car. "Has anyone contacted Child Protective Services or a guardian?" This question highlighted one of the unique challenges of Tyler's case. He was a juvenile who had allegedly murdered both of his parents, leaving him without a legal guardian to be present during police questioning. Officers had already located contact information for Sarah Bennett's mother, Helen Morrison, who lived in Oklahoma City, about an hour away, but she had not yet been notified of her daughter's death or her grandson's arrest. Michael's brother David Bennett lived in Dallas, several hours away, and also remained unaware of the tragedy that had just occurred. Following proper protocol for juvenile suspects, Detective Murphy decided to delay any substantive interrogation until a guardian could be present and a public defender assigned. Tyler was transported to the Broken Arrow Police Department at 12:27 a.m., where he was placed in an interview room designed for juvenile suspects, with softer lighting and less institutional furnishings than standard interrogation rooms. He was offered water and snacks, both of which he accepted, and was told that he would be held until appropriate adults could be contacted to be present during questioning. Tyler's demeanor during this initial holding period was observed and documented by multiple officers and a juvenile services coordinator who was called to the station. All reported the same unsettling observation. Tyler appeared completely calm and composed, even comfortable, showing none of the signs of trauma, fear, or emotional distress that would be expected from a 14-year-old who had just killed his parents, regardless of whether the killings were justified, accidental, or premeditated. He ate the snacks provided, drank water, and when asked if he was okay or needed anything, responded politely that he was fine and just wanted to answer questions, and get things settled. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Detective Murphy received a call informing M that Sarah Bennett's mother, Helen Morrison, had been notified of the deaths and of Tyler's arrest. The notification had been delivered by Oklahoma City police officers, as is standard protocol when informing family members of deaths in another jurisdiction. Helen, according to the officers who delivered the news, had collapsed upon hearing that her daughter was dead, requiring medical attention from paramedics called to the scene. When she learned that Tyler was the one who had killed Sarah and Michael, her distress had intensified to the point that doctors recommended she be hospitalized overnight for observation and sedation. With Helen Morrison unable to serve as Tyler's guardian for the interrogation, authorities contacted Michael's brother David, reaching him at his home in Dallas at 2 a.m. David Bennett's reaction to the news was one of complete disbelief and shock. He initially refused to believe what he was being told, insisting there must be some mistake, that Tyler couldn't possibly have done what he was being accused of. When the officer on the phone confirmed that Tyler had confessed to the killings during his 911 call, David fell silent for several long moments before asking a question that would echo through the entire investigation and trial. Why? Dear God, why would he do that? David agreed to drive to Broken Arrow immediately to serve as Tyler's guardian during questioning, a role that placed him in the impossible position of supporting his nephew while grieving his brother's murder. He arrived at Broken Arrow Police Department at approximately 5:30 a.m., exhausted from the drive and the emotional trauma, and was immediately briefed by Detective Murphy on what had occurred and what Tyler had already stated. David asked to see his nephew before the formal interrogation, and that meeting, observed by police through a one-way mirror, provided another glimpse into Tyler's disturbing psychological state. When David entered the room where Tyler had been waiting, the 14-year-old looked up and said simply, "Hi, Uncle David." There was no emotion in his voice, no apparent recognition of the enormity of what had happened or the pain his uncle must be feeling. David, his eyes red from crying during the drive, approached his nephew and asked the same question he had asked the police officer hours earlier. "Tyler, why? Why did you do this?" Tyler's response, according to David's later testimony, was a shrug and the words, "I don't really know how to explain it. I just needed them to not be here anymore." This answer, so inadequate and yet so revealing of Tyler's inability or unwillingness to articulate his motivations, would become a recurring theme throughout the investigation and trial. When pressed for more explanation, Tyler simply repeated variations of the same sentiment. He had wanted his parents gone, he had decided killing them was the solution, and now it was done. The formal interrogation began at 6:15 a.m. on October 16, 2018, with David Bennett and a public defender named Robert Chambers present to protect Tyler's interests. Also present were Detective Murphy, another detective named Lisa Chen, who specialized in juvenile cases, and a video recording system that captured every moment of the 4-hour interrogation that followed. Tyler, despite having been awake all night, appeared alert and focused, answering questions clearly and with minimal hesitation. Detective Murphy began by establishing the timeline of events, asking Tyler to describe his actions from the time he woke up on October 15th through the time of his arrest. Tyler provided a detailed chronological account, attending church with his parents, having lunch at the restaurant, spending the afternoon in his room, having dinner with his family, waiting for his parents to go to bed, retrieving the gun, entering their bedroom, and shooting them both. His narrative was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, as if he were describing a homework assignment or a mundane errand rather than the murder of his parents.
Yes. Can you tell me what happened then? Tyler described his mother waking up, sitting up in bed, realizing what had happened, and pleading with him. Detective Murphy noted the lack of emotion in Tyler's voice as he recounted his mother's final words, her desperate attempt to reach him, her promises that they could fix whatever was wrong. "Did you consider putting the gun down when your mother asked you to?"
Murphy asked. "No," Tyler responded. "It was too late by then. I'd already shot Dad. If I didn't shoot her too, she'd call the police and I'd be arrested anyway, so I had to." This cold logic, this calculation of consequences and conclusion that killing his mother was necessary once his father was already dead demonstrated exactly the kind of premeditated thinking that would make first-degree murder charges virtually impossible to challenge. Defense Attorney Chambers, listening to his teenage client calmly explain murdering his mother as a tactical necessity, periodically interrupted to remind Tyler he didn't have to answer certain questions. But Tyler consistently waved off these protections, insisting he wanted to tell the truth and cooperate fully. The most crucial part of the interrogation focused on Tyler's motivations. Detective Murphy, with his years of experience interviewing killers, tried multiple approaches to get Tyler to articulate why he had wanted his parents dead. Were they abusive? Did they hurt him physically or emotionally? Were there conflicts over rules, restrictions, or expectations? Had something happened recently that triggered his actions? Tyler's answers to all these questions were essentially negative. "Were your parents mean to you, Tyler?" Murphy asked, directly. "Not really. I mean, they had rules and stuff, but nothing crazy." "Did they hit you, hurt you in any way?" "No." "Did they say cruel things, make you feel bad about yourself?" Tyler paused at this question, seeming to consider it carefully before answering. "They were disappointed sometimes, like they wanted me to be more excited about things they thought were important. But they didn't, call me names or tell me I was worthless or anything. They were pretty normal parents, I guess." "So, if they were normal parents who didn't abuse you, why did you want to kill them?" Another long pause. Tyler looked down at his hands, then back at the detective. "I can't really explain it in a way that makes sense. I just felt like I needed to do it, like my life couldn't move forward with them in it. I know that sounds stupid. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's how I felt." This inability to provide a coherent motive would frustrate investigators, prosecutors, and eventually the public as details of the case became widely known. Here was a teenager from a privileged background with parents who by all accounts loved and supported him, who had committed a terrible double murder apparently without any clear reason. The absence of an understandable motive made the crime even more disturbing, suggesting something fundamentally broken in Tyler's psychology rather than an extreme response to extreme circumstances.
Detective Chen, taking over the questioning at one point, tried a different approach, asking Tyler about his journal and internet searches. Had he been planning this for a long time? Tyler acknowledged that he had been thinking about it for maybe a year or so, that he had researched other cases to learn from them, and that he had been waiting for the right opportunity when he felt ready to go through with it. "Did you ever think about the consequences?" Chen asked. "About what would happen to you after?" "Yeah, I thought about it," Tyler said. "I knew I'd probably go to prison. I researched that too, how long juveniles get for killing their parents. I figured it would be worth it to be free of them, even if being free meant being in prison. That probably doesn't make sense either." It didn't make sense. Not to the detectives, not to Tyler's uncle sitting beside him with tears streaming down his face, not to the defense attorney who was beginning to realize his client's own words were building an overwhelming case against him. But it was Tyler's truth, incomprehensible as it was, and he delivered it with the same flat affect that had characterized his entire interaction with authorities. As the interrogation continued, forensic evidence was being gathered at the Bennett home by crime scene investigators who would work through the early morning hours documenting every aspect of the scene. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, showing the victim's positions, the lack of signs of struggle, the gun's placement on the nightstand. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that both victims had been shot while in bed, with no indication that either had been standing or moving when shot.
Ballistics examination of the recovered bullets would confirm they were fired from the Glock 17 found at the scene, and gunshot residue tests on Tyler's hands would come back positive, despite his attempt to wash it off. The biometric safe in Michael's office was examined and found to have Tyler's fingerprint registered in its memory, explaining how he had accessed the weapon. Tyler's bedroom was thoroughly searched, revealing the journal with its incriminating entries, his laptop and phone, which would undergo extensive forensic examination, and the plastic bag containing his blood-spattered clothes from the night of the murders. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Tyler Bennett had carefully planned and executed the murders of his parents, had taken steps to document his intent beforehand, and had shown no remorse or normal emotional response afterward. By mid-morning on October 16th, Detective Murphy had more than enough evidence to charge Tyler with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The confession alone would have been sufficient, but the physical evidence, the journal entries, the internet search history, and the lack of any evidence of abuse or mitigating circumstances all combined to create an overwhelming case. Tyler was formally charged at 11 a.m., with his arraignment scheduled for the following day. He was transported to a juvenile detention facility in Tulsa, where he would be held pending trial. The news of the murders spread rapidly through Broken Arrow and then across the state of Oklahoma. By afternoon, media trucks had descended on the usually quiet neighborhood of Aspen Creek Drive, with reporters conducting interviews with shocked neighbors and broadcasting live from in front of the Bennett home. The story had everything that captures media attention: an affluent family, a teenage killer, parents murdered in their sleep, and the haunting absence of any clear motive or warning signs. St. Mark's Episcopal Church, where the Bennetts had been regular attendees, held an emergency prayer service that evening, attended by hundreds of community members struggling to process what had happened. Reverend Thomas Patterson, who had known the family well, spoke emotionally about Sarah and Michael's devotion to their community and their faith, about their love for their son, and about the impossibility of understanding how such tragedy could occur. "We gather tonight in grief and confusion," Reverend Patterson told the assembled congregation, his voice breaking. "We mourn Sarah and Michael Bennett, taken from us in the most terrible way imaginable. We pray for their souls, and we pray for understanding of something that may be beyond our capacity to understand. We pray also for Tyler, a child who has done an unspeakable thing, and we struggle with how to reconcile our compassion for children with the horror of what this particular child has done." The Bennett's extended families, meanwhile, were dealing with the immediate practical and emotional challenges of the tragedy. Helen Morrison, Sarah's mother, had been released from the hospital but remained in a state of shocked grief, unable to accept that her daughter was dead and that her grandson was the killer. She would later tell investigators that she had never seen any warning signs in Tyler, never suspected he was capable of violence, and couldn't reconcile the polite, quiet boy she knew with the monster who had murdered her daughter. David Bennett, Michael's brother, faced the dual trauma of losing his brother and trying to support a nephew who showed no remorse for what he had done. In the days following the murders, David would tell reporters that he felt like he was living in a nightmare, that the Tyler he thought he knew couldn't possibly be the same person who had cold-bloodedly executed his parents. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will have all been a bad dream, but it's real. My brother is dead. Sarah is dead. And Tyler, that quiet kid who seemed so normal, is a killer." How do you process that? How do you move forward from that? As October turned to November and preparations began for Tyler's trial, the psychiatric evaluations that would prove crucial to his legal defense were conducted. Dr. Patricia Hammond, a forensic psychiatrist with extensive experience evaluating juvenile offenders, spent multiple sessions with Tyler, attempting to understand his psychological state and determine whether mental illness could explain his actions. Her preliminary report, filed with the court in early November, would complicate the narrative in ways that both the prosecution and defense would struggle to address. Dr. Hammond's evaluation concluded that Tyler showed significant markers consistent with emerging antisocial personality disorder, including lack of empathy, shallow emotional responses, manipulation of others, and absence of remorse or guilt. However, she also noted that definitive diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder is typically not made in juveniles, as some of these traits can be part of normal adolescent development and may change as the brain matures. More significantly, Dr. Hammond found no evidence of psychosis, delusions, or other severe mental illnesses that would have prevented Tyler from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. Tyler Bennett knew that killing his parents was wrong, both morally and legally, Dr. Hammond wrote in her report. He planned his actions in advance, took steps to ensure success, and demonstrated clear understanding of consequences by immediately calling police and confessing. While he shows significant psychological abnormalities that warrant concern and treatment, he does not meet the legal threshold for insanity. He is competent to stand trial and was competent at the time of the offense. This finding meant that the defense could not argue insanity or incompetence, the most straightforward paths to avoiding a murder conviction. Instead, they would need to focus on Tyler's age, arguing that a 14-year-old, regardless of apparent sophistication, cannot be held to the same standard of culpability as an adult. They would need to emphasize the still developing adolescent brain, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the inappropriateness of treating a child as if he were a hardened adult criminal. It would be an uphill battle, especially given Tyler's own words and actions, but it was the only strategy available. On March 4, 2019, nearly 5 months after the murders that had shocked Oklahoma, Tyler Bennett's trial began in the Tulsa County District Court. The intervening months had been consumed by legal maneuvering over a fundamental question: should Tyler be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile justice system? The stakes of this decision could not have been higher. In the juvenile system, Tyler would face commitment to a juvenile facility until age 19, with possible extension until 21, meaning he could potentially be free while still a young man. As an adult, he faced the possibility of life in prison, decades of incarceration that would effectively end his life as he knew it. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a 58-year-old jurist with 20 years on the bench and a reputation for fairness but firmness, held extensive hearings on the transfer question throughout January and February 2019. She heard testimony from psychologists about adolescent brain development and Tyler's capacity for rehabilitation, from prosecutors about the severity and premeditated nature of the crimes, and from both families about the impact of the murders and their views on appropriate punishment. The decision, ultimately announced in late February, was that Tyler would be tried as an adult for 2 counts of first-degree murder, with possible sentencing enhancements due to the murders occurring in the victim's home and involving multiple victims. This ruling meant that Tyler faced a possible sentence of life without parole, though Oklahoma law prevented the death penalty for crimes committed by juveniles. It also meant that jury selection would follow adult procedures, with potential jurors drawn from the general population rather than handled through juvenile court processes. The trial was scheduled to last approximately 3 weeks, with both sides preparing to present extensive evidence and expert testimony about Tyler's mental state, his motivations, and the question of whether a 14-year-old could truly be held fully accountable for premeditated murder. The courtroom on opening day was filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds directed to watch proceedings on monitors in auxiliary rooms. Tyler entered wearing a suit purchased by his defense team, designed to make him look young and sympathetic rather than dangerous. Now 15 years old, having spent his 15th birthday in juvenile detention, Tyler remained small and slight, his youthful appearance creating cognitive dissonance with the horrific crimes he was accused of committing. He walked to the defense table with his head slightly bowed, never making eye contact with the gallery where his maternal grandmother Helen and his uncle David sat on opposite sides of the aisle, unable to reconcile their grief and their family loyalty. The prosecution team was led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Hartley, a career prosecutor known for her methodical approach to building cases and her particular expertise in homicide trials. Hartley was 43 years old, with 18 years in the DA's office, and had specifically requested assignment to the Bennett case, feeling that the facts demanded a prosecutor who could navigate the complexities of trying a juvenile as an adult, while maintaining focus on the victims and the deliberate nature of their murders. Assisting her were two additional prosecutors whose combined experience in forensic evidence and psychological testimony would prove crucial. The defense team was led by Public Defender Michael Torres, a passionate advocate for juvenile defendants who had built his career on the principle that children, regardless of their crimes, deserve treatment focused on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Torres, 39 years old and a public defender for 12 years, had initially been reluctant to take Tyler's case given the overwhelming evidence of guilt and the difficulty of generating sympathy for someone who had murdered his own parents without apparent provocation. But his commitment to the principle that children are different from adults, even children who commit terrible crimes, ultimately led him to accept the assignment. Jury selection had consumed 2 weeks in late February, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for their views on juvenile justice, parental responsibility, mental illness, and their ability to consider evidence of a teenager's capacity for change despite horrific actions. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging from age 28 to 66, including 3 parents of teenagers who both sides believed might be sympathetic to arguments about adolescent brain development and rehabilitation potential. Prosecutor Jennifer Hartley's opening statement was delivered with controlled emotion, her voice strong but not theatrical, her presentation methodical rather than sensationalist. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, standing before the jury box with Tyler visible at the defense table behind her, "this is a case about murder. Not just any murder, but the calculated, premeditated killing of 2 people while they slept. 2 people who had done nothing to deserve their fate except love and provide for the person who killed them. Those people were Michael and Sarah Bennett, and the killer was their own son, Tyler Bennett, who sits before you today."
Hartley used a large screen to display photographs of Michael and Sarah from life, images that showed them smiling, vibrant, alive. She described their backgrounds, their careers, their involvement in their community, and most importantly, their dedication to their son. "The Bennetts gave Tyler every advantage," Hartley told the jury. "They lived in a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood. They sent him to good schools. They supported his interests. They took him on vacations. By every measure available, they were devoted, loving parents. And Tyler Bennett repaid that love by shooting them in their bed." The prosecutor then outlined the timeline of the murders, using Tyler's own 911 call, his confession, and the physical evidence to paint a picture of deliberate, planned violence. She played portions of the 911 recording, letting jurors hear Tyler's unsettlingly calm voice announcing that he had killed his parents. She described how Tyler had researched other family murders for months, how he had written in his journal about wanting his parents dead, how he had carefully planned the timing and method of their murders. "Tyler Bennett was 14 years old when he committed these crimes," Hartley acknowledged, addressing directly the argument she knew the defense would emphasize. "The defense will spend considerable time telling you about adolescent brain development, about impulsivity and poor judgment in teenagers, about the capacity for change and rehabilitation. But ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about a teenager making a bad decision in a moment of anger or confusion. This is about months of planning, deliberate research, careful execution, and then a confession delivered with no remorse, no horror, no recognition that what he had done was unspeakable." Hartley concluded her opening by focusing on the victims and what had been stolen from them. Sarah Bennett was 39 years old. She had decades of life ahead of her. Michael Bennett was 42. He had years of work he loved,
family he cherished, experiences he would never have. Tyler Bennett took all of that away, permanently, irrevocably. And he did it not because he was abused, not because he was neglected, not because he had no other choice, but simply because he wanted to. That is not adolescent impulsivity. That is murder in the first degree, and it demands accountability. Defense attorney Michael Torres approached his opening statement with a fundamentally different strategy, beginning not with the crime, but with Tyler's humanity. "Tyler Bennett is a child," he said softly, his voice requiring jurors to lean forward slightly to hear clearly. "Not was a child when these crimes occurred, is a child. Right now, sitting before you, 15 years old, his brain still developing, his capacity for judgment and emotional regulation still forming. The prosecution wants you to see him as a monster, as someone fundamentally evil who deserves to be locked away forever. I ask you to see him as what he is, a deeply troubled child whose actions, as terrible as they were, demand our understanding of why they occurred and whether he can be helped." Torres spent considerable time in his opening establishing the scientific framework that would dominate his defense: adolescent brain development. He described how the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and understanding consequences, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. He explained that teenagers, even intelligent ones, process risk and reward differently than adults, often unable to fully grasp the permanent nature of their actions, or to override impulses with rational thought. Tyler Bennett planned these murders, Torres acknowledged, not attempting to dispute the obvious evidence. He thought about them, researched them, and ultimately carried them out. But the question we must ask is not just what he did, but why he did it, and whether a 14-year-old brain is capable of the kind of evil intent that the law requires for first-degree murder. The science tells us that adolescents are fundamentally different from adults in ways that matter legally and morally. The defense attorney then addressed what he knew would be the prosecution's strongest argument: the lack of apparent motive or mitigating circumstances. You will hear that Tyler's parents were not abusive, that they provided well for him, that there was no obvious trigger for his actions. And you'll wonder, as we all do, why he would do something so terrible without clear provocation. The answer, ladies and gentlemen, lies in something the prosecution doesn't want you to consider: mental illness. Torres outlined the psychiatric evaluations that would be presented, emphasizing Tyler's emerging antisocial personality traits, his inability to experience normal empathy or emotional connection, and the possibility that undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues had led him to actions he could not fully understand or control. Tyler Bennett is sick, Torres argued. He needs treatment, intensive psychological intervention, and the possibility of rehabilitation that our justice system is supposed to provide for children. What he doesn't need is to be thrown away as if he were an adult criminal beyond redemption. The opening statement set the parameters for a trial that would ultimately be less about what happened, which was undisputed, and more about how to understand and punish a child who had committed an adult crime. The prosecution would focus relentlessly on Tyler's actions, his planning, his lack of remorse, and the devastating impact on the victims and their families. The defense would emphasize Tyler's age, his brain development, his mental health issues, and the possibility of rehabilitation, arguing that life without parole for a 14-year-old was effectively a death sentence and morally wrong regardless of the crime committed. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had been called to the Bennett home on the night of October 15, 2018. Officer Jacob Morrison, the first to arrive and interact with Tyler, described finding the teenager sitting calmly on the front porch, showing no signs of emotional distress or trauma. "I've responded to numerous crime scenes in my career," Morrison testified, and I've encountered suspects, victims, and witnesses in various states of shock, panic, grief, or anger. Tyler Bennett showed none of those emotions. He was calm, cooperative, and emotionless in a way that honestly disturbed me. Detective Sean Murphy walked the jury through the investigation, the crime scene evidence, and Tyler's confession. His testimony was clinical and methodical, but the facts he presented required no embellishment to convey their horror. He described the condition of the master bedroom when police arrived, the positions of the bodies, the evidence that both victims had been killed while in bed. He explained how forensic analysis had confirmed Tyler's account of events, how gunshot residue on Tyler's hands, despite his attempt to wash it off, proved his proximity to the shootings, how blood spatter patterns confirmed the sequence of shots.
Perhaps most damning was Detective Murphy's testimony about Tyler's journal and internet search history. The journal entries were read aloud in court, Tyler's own words expressing his desire for his parents to be dead and his planning of their murders. The internet searches were displayed on the courtroom screen, stark evidence of premeditation. How to shoot someone so they die instantly. Do people wake up when shot? Best way to kill parents while sleeping. Several jurors visibly reacted to this evidence, exchanging glances that suggested Tyler's own documented thoughts were building a powerful case against him. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chen, provided testimony that was both technical and emotionally difficult for many in the courtroom to hear. He described Michael Bennett's cause of death as a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, delivered at close range, causing immediate death through catastrophic brain injury. Sarah Bennett's death, he testified, had been slower, resulting from 3 gunshot wounds to the chest, abdomen, and throat, with death occurring within several minutes as she bled internally and her lungs filled with blood. Dr. Chen, Prosecutor Hartley asked, in your professional opinion, did either victim suffer? Michael Bennett likely died instantly, without conscious awareness of what was happening, Chen responded. Sarah Bennett, however, was conscious for at least some period after being shot. Given the nature and location of her injuries, she would have experienced pain and awareness of what was happening. It would not have been a peaceful death. This testimony, combined with the knowledge that Sarah had tried to reach out to her son in her final moments, had tried to convince him to stop, created a visceral emotional impact in the courtroom. Helen Morrison, Sarah's mother, fled the courtroom sobbing, unable to bear hearing the details of her daughter's final moments. Even some jurors were visibly affected, though they maintained their composure and attention. The prosecution's final witness before resting their case was David Bennett, Michael's brother, who testified about the family dynamics he had observed and Tyler's behavior in the hours after his arrest. David's testimony was emotional but controlled, his grief evident but not overwhelming his ability to provide clear information. He described the Bennett family as close and loving, with no indication of dysfunction or abuse that might explain Tyler's actions. Did you ever see Michael or Sarah mistreat Tyler? Hartley asked. Never, David responded firmly. They loved him. They were proud of him. Maybe they had normal parental expectations about grades and behavior, but nothing excessive or abusive. Tyler had a good life with them. That's what makes this so incomprehensible. David then described his interactions with Tyler in the hours after the murders, how his nephew had shown no remorse, no horror at what he had done, no apparent understanding of the pain he had caused. I asked him why, David testified, his voice breaking slightly. I kept asking why he would do this to people who loved him, and he just shrugged, like it was nothing, like he'd forgotten to take out the trash instead of murdering his parents. The defense's case began in the trial's second week with Dr. Patricia Hammond, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Tyler. Dr. Hammond's testimony was complex and nuanced, acknowledging Tyler's psychological disturbances while also establishing that he understood his actions were wrong.
She described Tyler's emerging antisocial traits, his lack of empathy, his inability to form normal emotional attachments, and the likelihood that these issues would persist without intensive treatment. Dr. Hammond, defense attorney Torres asked, in your professional opinion, was Tyler capable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions when he killed his parents? He understood intellectually that killing was wrong and illegal, Hammond responded carefully, but I'm not convinced he understood it emotionally or in a way that would have deterred him. His ability to experience normal moral emotions appears to be significantly impaired. And what about his capacity for rehabilitation? Can a 15-year-old with these issues be helped? With intensive, long-term psychiatric treatment, there is potential for improvement. The adolescent brain is still developing, and interventions during this period can have effects that wouldn't be possible with an adult whose brain is fully formed. I can't promise complete rehabilitation, but I can say that writing Tyler off as beyond help at age 15 is premature and inconsistent with what we know about brain plasticity. The defense also presented Dr. Marcus Webb, a neuroscientist specializing in adolescent brain development. Dr. Webb used brain scans and diagrams to explain to the jury how teenage brains differ from adult brains in crucial ways. He testified that the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and long-term planning, undergoes significant development between ages 14 and 25, meaning Tyler's brain at 14 was fundamentally different from what it would become as an adult. Teenagers are notorious for believing they're invincible, for not fully grasping permanent consequences. Tyler's research and planning don't negate the biological reality that his brain was not fully developed. The prosecution's cross-examination of these experts focused on the distinction between capacity for understanding and actual understanding. Prosecutor Hartley pressed both psychologists on whether Tyler knew killing was wrong, whether he tried to conceal his actions, whether he showed awareness of consequences by calling 911 and confessing. Both experts acknowledged that Tyler showed cognitive awareness of wrongfulness, though they maintained that cognitive knowledge and emotional or moral understanding were different things. Perhaps the most anticipated and controversial decision of the trial was whether Tyler would testify in his own defense. Defense attorney Torres agonized over this choice, knowing that putting Tyler on the stand risked exposing his lack of remorse and emotional flatness to the jury, but also knowing that the jury might want to hear from Tyler, might need to look into his eyes and try to understand who he was and why he had done what he had done. Ultimately, after extensive consultation with Tyler himself and with his psychiatric experts, Torres decided to put his client on the stand, believing that humanizing him was worth the risk. Tyler Bennett took the stand on March 19, 2019, the trial's third week, wearing a dress shirt and tie that made him look even younger than his 15 years. His testimony would last nearly 4 hours across 2 days, and it would provide the most insight yet into the mind of a teenage killer. Defense attorney Torres began gently, asking Tyler about his childhood, his parents, his school experiences. Tyler answered in his characteristic flat tone, describing a life that seemed normal and unremarkable, with parents who cared for him and provided for him. "Tyler," Torres asked carefully, "do you understand that what you did was wrong?" "Yes," Tyler responded, his voice quiet but clear. "Do you feel bad about it?" Tyler paused for a long moment, appearing to genuinely consider the question. "I know I should feel bad," he finally said. "People keep telling me I should feel horrible and guilty and want to take it back, but I don't really feel those things. I don't know why. There's just nothing there when I try to feel bad about it." This admission, honest but devastating to his case, exemplified the challenge of Tyler's defense. His honesty about his lack of remorse made him seem monstrous, but his confusion about why he didn't feel remorse suggested something broken in his psychological makeup rather than pure evil.
Torres tried to frame this as evidence of mental illness rather than moral failure, but the distinction was subtle and difficult for jurors to grasp.
Tyler, Hartley asked at one point, her voice sharp, when your mother woke up after you shot your father, when she reached out to you and begged you to stop, did you consider listening to her? No, Tyler answered honestly. Why not? Because it was too late. I'd already shot my dad. If I stopped then, I'd go to prison anyway, so I had to finish. This cold calculation, this decision to kill his mother not out of rage or passion, but out of a logical assessment that he was already committed to a path, encapsulated exactly what made Tyler's crime so disturbing and so difficult to attribute to typical adolescent impulsivity. Defense attorney Torres objected to the characterization, but the damage was done. Tyler's own testimony had demonstrated exactly the kind of calculated thinking that the prosecution needed to establish first-degree murder with premeditation. His honesty, while perhaps admirable in some abstract sense, had effectively built the case against him. The trial's final phase consisted of closing arguments and victim impact statements, both designed to help jurors understand the full scope of what Tyler had done and what justice required. Prosecutor Hartley's closing argument was passionate and forceful, summarizing the evidence of premeditation and Tyler's lack of remorse, while acknowledging but minimizing the significance of his age and brain development. Ladies and gentlemen, Hartley told the jury, Tyler Bennett wants you to believe that he is simply a sick child who couldn't help what he did, who deserves treatment and rehabilitation rather than punishment. But the evidence tells a different story. Tyler Bennett researched how to kill his parents for months. He wrote in his journal about wanting them dead. He secured a weapon, waited for the right moment, executed his plan with precision, and then showed no remorse whatsoever. This is not the behavior of a child acting on impulse. This is the behavior of someone who made a choice, a terrible choice, and must face the consequences of that choice. Hartley addressed the brain development arguments directly, pointing out that millions of 14-year-olds manage to navigate adolescence without murdering their parents, that underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes do not inevitably lead to violence, and that Tyler's careful planning demonstrated exactly the kind of consequential thinking that adolescents were supposedly incapable of. The defense wants you to believe Tyler couldn't understand what he was doing, she argued, but he researched it extensively, planned it carefully, and executed it successfully. That's not lack of understanding. That's premeditated murder. The prosecutor concluded by refocusing on the victims and what they had lost. Sarah Bennett will never see her son grow up, will never hold grandchildren, will never celebrate another holiday with her family. Michael Bennett will never finish the career he worked so hard to build, will never take another breath, will never know another moment of joy or love or hope. Tyler Bennett took all of that away, permanently and deliberately, and he must be held accountable. Defense attorney Torres emphasized redemption, rehabilitation, and the fundamental difference between children and adults that the law recognizes in numerous other contexts. If Tyler Bennett were charged with any other crime, the law would recognize him as a juvenile, treat him as a juvenile, and focus on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. But because the crimes he committed are so serious, we suddenly want to pretend he's an adult. We can't have it both ways. Either children are different from adults in ways that matter legally, or they're not. Torres walked the jury through the scientific testimony about brain development, emphasizing that Tyler's actions, while terrible, occurred during a period of his life when his brain was literally incapable of adult-level judgment and impulse control. He pointed to Tyler's confused testimony about not understanding why he didn't feel remorse as evidence of genuine mental illness rather than moral evil. Tyler is sick. He has been sick for years, and no one recognized it or got him help. Now we have the opportunity to provide that help, to invest in intensive psychiatric treatment that might allow him to someday understand the magnitude of what he did and become a functioning member of society. Or we can throw him away, lock him up forever, and guarantee that a 15-year-old boy will die in prison having never had a chance at redemption. The defense attorney concluded with an appeal to the jury's compassion and their understanding of childhood as a time of potential and change. Tyler Bennett made a terrible choice, but he made it when he was 14 years old, when his brain was still developing, when he was struggling with mental illness that no one had diagnosed or treated. The question before you is not whether what he did was wrong. We all agree it was. The question is whether this child deserves life without parole, whether he should be condemned to die in prison with no possibility of ever demonstrating that he has changed. I ask you to remember that he is still a child, still capable of growth and change, still deserving of some measure of hope. Before the jury began deliberations, Judge Hawkins allowed victim impact statements from family members, giving them the opportunity to address both the jury and Tyler directly about the impact of the murders. Helen Morrison, Sarah's mother, was the first to speak, approaching the podium with the help of a family member, her grief and age evident in her shaking hands and tear-filled voice. "Sarah was my baby," she began, her voice breaking immediately. She was kind and funny and full of life. She loved teaching, loved her church, loved her family, and she loved Tyler with all her heart. She tried so hard to be a good mother to him, to give him everything he needed, and he killed her. He shot her while she begged him to stop, while she tried to reach him, while she still believed there was something good in him worth saving.
Helen turned to look directly at Tyler, who sat at the defense table with his eyes downcast. "I don't understand you," she continued, her voice gaining strength through her pain. "I will never understand you. You took my daughter from me. You took your own mother from this world, and you sit there showing no remorse, no guilt, no recognition of the enormity of what you've done. I don't know if you're sick or evil or both. But I know that Sarah is dead because of you, and no amount of talk about brain development or mental illness will ever make that okay." David Bennett spoke next, representing Michael's side of the family. His statement was shorter, but equally powerful, focusing on the brother he had lost and the nephew he no longer recognized. "Michael was a good man," David said simply. "He worked hard, he loved his family, he tried to do right by everyone in his life. He brought Tyler to this country to give him opportunities, to help him build a better life, and Tyler killed him for it. I don't have any words of wisdom or insight. I just know my brother is dead, murdered by his own son, and nothing will ever make that right." After the victim impact statements, Judge Hawkins provided the jury with their instructions, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the definitions of premeditation and intent, and the factors they should consider in determining guilt. She emphasized that sympathy for Tyler's age should not prevent them from finding him guilty if the evidence supported that verdict, but that they should carefully consider all the evidence, including expert testimony about adolescent brain development and mental health, in reaching their decision. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:30 p.m. on March 21, 2019, and the courtroom settled into the anxious waiting that characterizes all criminal trials. Tyler was returned to holding cells, while family members, reporters, and court staff lingered in the hallways, speculating about how long deliberations might take and what verdict might emerge. The length of deliberation can often signal the jury's confidence in their decision. Quick verdicts typically indicate clear-cut cases, while extended deliberations suggest disagreement or uncertainty. In this case, the jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours over 2 days, suggesting genuine struggle with the questions before them. They sent several notes to Judge Hawkins, requesting clarification on legal definitions and asking to review specific pieces of evidence, including Tyler's journal entries and portions of his testimony. These requests suggested they were taking their responsibility seriously, carefully weighing the evidence against the legal standards they had been given.
At 4:47 p.m. on March 22, 2019, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly as word spread, with Tyler brought from holding and both families taking their seats in the gallery. The atmosphere was electric with tension, every person present understanding that the next few minutes would determine Tyler Bennett's fate and, in many ways, define how society views juvenile offenders who commit terrible crimes. Judge Hawkins entered, took her seat, and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman, a 54-year-old engineer named Robert Chen, stood and confirmed that they had. The bailiff retrieved the verdict forms and handed them to Judge Hawkins, who reviewed them silently before returning them to the foreman to read aloud. In the matter of State of Oklahoma versus Tyler Bennett, on the count of murder in the first degree regarding the death of Michael Bennett, we find the defendant guilty.
A ripple of reaction moved through the courtroom. Relief from the prosecution table, tears from Sarah's family, a soft gasp from Tyler's grandmother Helen. Tyler himself showed no visible reaction, his face remaining as impassive as it had throughout the trial. On the count of murder in the first degree regarding the death of Sarah Bennett, the foreman continued, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts, while not surprising given the overwhelming evidence in Tyler's own confession, still carried tremendous weight in their finality. Tyler Bennett, 15 years old, had been convicted as an adult of 2 counts of first-degree murder. All that remained was sentencing, which Judge Hawkins scheduled for 2 months later to allow time for pre-sentencing reports, additional psychological evaluations, and preparation of arguments about appropriate punishment. On May 17, 2019, 7 months after the murders that had devastated the Bennett family and shocked Oklahoma, Tyler Bennett returned to court for a sentencing hearing. The 2 months since his conviction had been filled with extensive psychological evaluations, pre-sentencing investigations, and passionate arguments from both prosecution and defense about what justice required for a 15-year-old convicted of murdering his parents. The fundamental question before Judge Patricia Hammond was not Tyler's guilt, which had been established beyond any doubt, but rather how to punish a crime so serious when committed by someone so young. Oklahoma law provided a range of sentencing options for juvenile offenders convicted as adults of first-degree murder. At the minimum end, Tyler could receive a sentence of life with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years, meaning he could potentially be released at age 39. At the maximum end, he could receive life without the possibility of parole, meaning he would die in prison with no hope of ever regaining freedom. The middle ground included various structured sentences that would keep Tyler incarcerated well into adulthood, but provide some eventual possibility of release based on demonstrated rehabilitation and behavioral progress. The pre-sentencing report, compiled by the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, provided a comprehensive assessment of Tyler's background, psychological state, and potential for rehabilitation. The report noted that Tyler had been a model detainee during his 7 months in juvenile detention, causing no disciplinary problems, participating cooperatively in all required programs, and showing no signs of violent or aggressive behavior towards staff or other juveniles. However, the report also noted that Tyler continued to show minimal emotional response when discussing his crimes and had made no meaningful progress in understanding or expressing remorse for what he had done. Dr. Patricia Hammond, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Tyler before trial, provided an updated assessment that painted a complex picture of a teenager whose psychological issues were severe but potentially treatable with long-term intervention. Tyler Bennett presents with significant antisocial traits that are deeply concerning, Dr. Hammond wrote in her supplemental report. However, given his age and the plasticity of the adolescent brain, I believe there remains potential for meaningful change with intensive psychiatric treatment. I cannot promise full rehabilitation, but I can say that condemning him to die in prison at age 15 removes any possibility of discovering whether treatment might allow him to develop normal empathy and moral reasoning. The defense team, led by Michael Torres, prepared extensive arguments for a sentence that would provide Tyler with eventual possibility of release. They commissioned additional expert reports from neuroscientists and juvenile justice specialists who emphasized that the Supreme Court had repeatedly recognized fundamental differences between juvenile and adult offenders, even when juveniles commit serious crimes. They pointed to cases like Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, which had established that mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders was unconstitutional and that individualized sentencing must consider youth and potential for rehabilitation.
Your Honor, Torres argued in his sentencing memorandum filed with the court, Tyler Bennett committed terrible crimes for which he must be punished, but he committed them when he was 14 years old, when his brain was still developing, when he was struggling with undiagnosed mental illness. Sentencing him to life without parole would be tantamount to saying that he is irredeemable, that nothing he does for the rest of his life can ever demonstrate sufficient change to warrant reconsideration. That determination violates everything we know about adolescent development and the human capacity for change. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Hartley, countered that Tyler's crimes were so heinous and his lack of remorse so complete that life without parole was not only appropriate but necessary to serve justice and protect society. Tyler Bennett did not commit a crime of passion or impulse, Hartley wrote in the state's sentencing memorandum. He planned these murders for months, researched how to execute them effectively, and showed no normal human emotion in their aftermath. The defense wants Your Honor to focus on his age and brain development, but we must also consider what he did and what his continued lack of remorse tells us about his capacity for rehabilitation. Hartley's memorandum included victim impact information that went beyond what had been presented at trial, documenting the ongoing trauma experienced by surviving family members. Helen Morrison, Sarah's mother, had been hospitalized twice since her daughter's murder for issues related to grief and depression. David Bennett had left his job in Dallas and relocated to Oklahoma City to be closer to family support systems, his own life fundamentally disrupted by his brother's murder. The extended Bennett and Morrison families had been torn apart by the tragedy, with some members supporting Tyler's rehabilitation and others demanding the harshest possible punishment. The sentencing hearing itself took place over 2 full days, with both sides presenting additional witnesses and arguments beyond what had been submitted in written form. The defense called several juvenile justice experts who testified about successful rehabilitation programs for serious juvenile offenders, providing examples of individuals who had committed terrible crimes as teenagers but had, with proper treatment and intervention, become productive members of society after their release. These experts emphasized that Tyler's current lack of remorse did not necessarily predict his capacity for change over decades of treatment and maturation. Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychologist who had worked with violent juvenile offenders for 20 years, testified that she had seen remarkable transformations in teenagers whose brain development and psychological growth allowed them to eventually understand and take responsibility for actions they couldn't fully comprehend when they committed them. At 15, Tyler Bennett may be incapable of genuine remorse, but at 35, after 2 decades of brain development and intensive therapy, he might be a completely different person. We cannot know what he might become unless we give him the chance to become it. The prosecution countered with testimony from Dr. Robert Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in risk assessment for violent offenders. Dr. Martinez had reviewed all of Tyler's records and evaluations and had concluded that Tyler represented an ongoing danger regardless of treatment. The level of planning, the absence of normal emotional responses, and the continued lack of remorse suggest deeply ingrained personality pathology, Dr. Martinez testified. While some juvenile offenders can be successfully rehabilitated, Tyler Bennett's psychological profile is consistent with individuals who present persistent danger throughout their lives. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful testimony came from family members who addressed the court during the sentencing phase. Helen Morrison, appearing frailer than she had during trial, spoke about the ongoing devastation of losing her daughter. "Every day I wake up, and for a moment I forget Sarah is gone. And then I remember, and the pain is as fresh as the day Tyler killed her. People tell me I should want him to have a chance at life, that I should support rehabilitation. But how can I wish him a future when he stole my daughter's future? How can I hope he finds peace when Sarah will never know peace again?"
David Bennett's testimony focused on his brother Michael and the loss the family had experienced. "Michael was my best friend, not just my brother," David said, struggling to maintain composure. "We talked every week, shared our lives, supported each other through everything. Tyler took that away. And what haunts me most is that Tyler doesn't seem to understand what he took. He can explain what he did, but he can't explain why, and he can't seem to grasp that he destroyed lives, plural, not just ended 2 lives, but destroyed dozens of others who loved Michael and Sarah." Tyler's own grandmother, Helen Morrison, found herself in the impossible position of grieving her daughter while also feeling some obligation to her grandson. In a statement that highlighted the complexity of the situation, she told the court, "I don't know what the right answer is. Part of me wants Tyler locked away forever for what he did to Sarah. But another part of me remembers that he's just a child, my grandson, and wonders if there's some way he could eventually become someone different than who he is now. I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't know if I should want him to have a future. I just know that this whole situation is a tragedy with no good outcome." On the second day of the sentencing hearing, Judge Hawkins allowed Tyler to make a statement if he chose to do so. This was Tyler's final opportunity to address the court, to express remorse, to perhaps show some emotional breakthrough that might influence his sentence. Defense attorney Torres had spent hours coaching Tyler on what to say, emphasizing the importance of showing genuine emotion and taking responsibility for his actions. But when Tyler took the stand, speaking directly to Judge Hawkins, his statement revealed the fundamental challenge of his case. "I know I did something terrible," Tyler said, his voice quiet but clear. "I know I killed my parents and hurt a lot of people. Everyone keeps telling me I should feel horrible guilt and remorse, and I understand intellectually why I should feel that way. But I still don't really feel it, and I don't know how to make myself feel something I don't feel. I'm sorry that I can't give people what they want from me. I'm sorry I can't explain why I did what I did in a way that makes sense. I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I don't know what else to say." This statement, honest but lacking the emotional content that might have generated sympathy, exemplified the impossible situation Tyler found himself in. His inability to fake remorse he didn't feel was in some ways admirable. He wasn't manipulating the court with false emotion, but his continued emotional flatness reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was fundamentally broken in ways that treatment might never fix. Judge Hawkins took a 30-minute recess after Tyler's statement to review her notes and finalize her decision. When court reconvened, the judge spent nearly 20 minutes explaining her reasoning before announcing the sentence, wanting to ensure that everyone present understood the difficult balance she was trying to strike between punishment and the recognition of Tyler's youth. "This is among the most difficult decisions I have faced in my 20 years on the bench," Judge Hawkins began, her voice heavy with the weight of her responsibility. "Tyler Bennett committed 2 brutal murders that devastated a family and shocked a community. The victims were his own parents, people who by all accounts loved him and provided for him. The crimes were planned and deliberate, showing a level of premeditation that cannot be dismissed or minimized. And Tyler has shown little to no remorse or normal emotional response to what he has done. The judge paused, looking directly at Tyler, who sat at the defense table with his customary impassive expression. However, she continued, Tyler Bennett was 14 years old when he committed these crimes. The law recognizes that children are different from adults in ways that matter. Their brains are still developing, their capacity for judgment is still forming, and their potential for change is greater than that of adults. The Supreme Court has made clear that even for the most serious crimes, we must consider youth and the possibility of rehabilitation when sentencing juvenile offenders. Judge Hawkins then reviewed the specific factors she had considered: Tyler's age, his lack of criminal history before these murders, the psychological evaluations indicating mental health issues, the absence of evidence that he had been abused or neglected by his parents, his behavior during detention, and the competing expert opinions about his potential for rehabilitation. She acknowledged the pain of the victims' families and their legitimate desire for justice and protection of society. She also acknowledged the defense's arguments about brain development and the human capacity for change. After careful consideration of all these factors, Judge Hawkins continued, her voice becoming more formal as she approached the actual pronouncement of sentence. I find that life without parole would be excessive for a 14-year-old offender, even one who committed crimes as serious as these. However, I also find that Tyler Bennett's actions demand substantial punishment and that society must be protected from the possibility that he remains dangerous despite treatment. The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person present holding their breath, waiting for the judge's actual sentence. Tyler sat motionless, his face unreadable. His grandmother, Helen, gripped the bench in front of her, her knuckles white. David Bennett leaned forward, his jaw clenched, waiting to hear if his nephew would ever have a chance at freedom. Tyler Bennett, Judge Hawkins said, looking directly at the teenager, on the count of first-degree murder of Michael Bennett, you are sentenced to life in prison. On the count of first-degree murder of Sarah Bennett, you are sentenced to life in prison. These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently. However, I am setting a minimum term of 45 years before you will be eligible for parole consideration. This means that at the earliest, you could be released at age 59, assuming you demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and no longer pose a danger to society.
The sentence was significant in its length. 45 years was among the longest minimum sentences ever given to a 14-year-old offender in Oklahoma. But it stopped short of life without parole, preserving some theoretical possibility that Tyler might eventually be released. The consecutive nature of the sentences emphasized the severity of having two victims, while the 45-year minimum ensured that Tyler would spend most of his life in prison, long enough for his brain to fully develop and for treatment to have maximum potential effect. I want to be clear, Judge Hawkins added, that eligibility for parole at 45 years does not guarantee release. It simply means that at that time, you may petition the parole board to consider whether you have changed sufficiently to warrant release. Whether you ever leave prison will depend entirely on whether you can demonstrate, over decades, that you have developed the capacity for empathy, remorse, and moral reasoning that you currently lack. You have destroyed 2 lives and devastated countless others. The question of whether you can ever redeem yourself remains open, but the burden of proving redemption will be entirely yours to bear. The judge concluded by addressing the families. To the Morrison and Bennett families, I know that no sentence can restore what you have lost or ease your pain. I can only hope that knowing Tyler Bennett will face serious consequences for his actions provides some measure of justice, even if it cannot provide peace. This court is adjourned." The reaction in the courtroom was mixed and complex. Some of Sarah and Michael's family members felt the sentence was too lenient, believing Tyler should never have any chance at freedom, regardless of his age when he committed the crimes. Others, including some who had initially wanted the harshest possible punishment, felt that the 45-year minimum struck an appropriate balance between accountability and recognition of Tyler's youth. Tyler himself showed no visible reaction to learning that he would spend, at minimum, the next 45 years in prison, a span of time longer than he had been alive. As Tyler was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning his journey into the adult prison system, where he would spend the rest of his youth and most of his adult life, the broader implications of his case began to emerge. Legal scholars and juvenile justice advocates pointed to the Tyler Bennett case as highlighting the challenges of trying to apply adult criminal standards to juvenile offenders, even when those juveniles commit terrible crimes. Some argued that the sentence was too harsh, that 45 years was effectively life without parole for a 14-year-old. Others countered that Tyler's lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his crimes justified the lengthy sentence. The case also sparked renewed debate about how to identify and intervene with troubled youth before they commit violent acts. Tyler had shown warning signs: his social isolation, his disturbing internet searches, his journal entries, but none had risen to the level that triggered intervention. Schools, mental health professionals, and parents struggled with the question of how to balance privacy, normal adolescent development, and the need to identify genuinely dangerous individuals. In the months following Tyler's sentencing, both the prosecution and defense filed appeals addressing different aspects of the case. The defense appealed the decision to try Tyler as an adult and the length of his sentence, arguing both violated constitutional protections for juvenile offenders. The prosecution cross-appealed, arguing that consecutive life sentences should have been imposed without the possibility of parole. These appeals would wind through Oklahoma's court system for years, with the case eventually reaching the Oklahoma Supreme Court, which would uphold both the adult prosecution decision and the 45-year minimum, finding that neither violated Tyler's constitutional rights. Tyler himself was transferred to a specialized facility for young adult offenders, where he would remain until turning 21 before potential transfer to the general adult prison population. Reports from his time in this facility indicated he remained a compliant inmate who caused no behavioral problems, but also continued to show limited emotional growth or development of empathy. He participated in mandatory counseling and educational programs, but according to staff reports, seemed to view them as obligations to be fulfilled rather than opportunities for genuine reflection and change. The Bennett home on Aspen Creek Drive remained empty for over a year after the murders, a ghostly reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Eventually, it was sold to a developer who demolished the house entirely, unable to find buyers willing to live in a place where such horror had ever occurred. A new home was built on the property, and a new family moved in, unaware of the specific history, but knowing only that something terrible had happened there once. For the surviving family members, life moved forward, but would never return to normal. Helen Morrison, Sarah's mother, spent years in grief counseling and eventually became involved with victim advocacy groups, channeling her pain into efforts to support other families affected by violent crime. David Bennett returned to his life in Dallas, but maintained regular contact with Oklahoma authorities, determined to ensure that if Tyler Bennett ever became eligible for parole, victims' families would have a voice in the decision. The extended Bennett and Morrison families remained fractured, with some members more forgiving toward Tyler than others, creating tensions that would persist for years. 10 years after the murders, on October 15, 2028, a memorial service was held at St. Mark's Episcopal Church to honor the memory of Michael and Sarah Bennett. Friends, family, and community members gathered to remember the couple whose lives had been cut short and to reflect on the lasting impact of their deaths. Reverend Thomas Patterson, now retired but still connected to the church community, led the service and spoke about the challenge of finding meaning in senseless tragedy. Michael and Sarah Bennett were people of faith, people who believed in goodness and tried to live according to those beliefs. Their deaths defy our understanding of justice and fairness, but their lives, the love they showed to others, the contributions they made to their community, these things endure. We honor them not by focusing on how they died, but by remembering how they lived, and by recommitting ourselves to the values they embodied. Tyler Bennett, now 24 years old and a decade into his sentence, was not present at the memorial service. He remained incarcerated, having spent nearly half his life in prison, with at minimum 35 more years to serve before the possibility of parole. According to prison reports, he had completed his high school equivalency degree and had begun taking college courses through a prison education program. He had participated in various psychological treatment programs, though evaluations continued to indicate limited progress in developing normal empathy or emotional responses.
In a letter he wrote to his grandmother, Helen Morrison, shortly after the 10th anniversary of his parents' deaths, a letter that Helen chose not to respond to, Tyler attempted to express something approaching understanding of what he had done. I am 24 years old now, and I have spent much of the past decade trying to understand why I did what I did when I was 14. I have been told repeatedly that I destroyed lives, that I committed evil, that I am a monster. I understand these things intellectually. I can see how my actions caused pain, but I still struggle to feel it the way I am told I should feel it. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever be capable of feeling it, or if something in me is permanently broken. I do not ask for forgiveness because I do not believe I deserve it. I only want you to know that I think about what I did every day, even if I cannot feel about it the way you would want me to. This letter, shared with prosecutors and the court, exemplified the ongoing challenge of Tyler Bennett's case. A young man who intellectually understood the wrongfulness of his actions, but seemed unable to generate the emotional and moral responses that might indicate genuine rehabilitation. Whether this represented permanent psychological damage, developmental delay that might eventually resolve, or something else entirely, remained an open question that would only be answered over the decades of his incarceration. As Tyler's case faded from headlines and public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies and scandals, it remained a touchstone in discussions of juvenile justice. Legal scholars continued to cite it in debates about appropriate sentencing for serious juvenile offenders. Mental health professionals used it as a case study in identifying and treating youth with antisocial traits. Families affected by similar tragedies looked to it as a precedent for how the justice system might handle their own impossible situations. The fundamental questions raised by Tyler Bennett's case, about culpability, about redemption, about the meaning of justice when a child commits an adult crime, remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Tyler Bennett killed his parents when he was 14 years old, showing calculation and planning that suggested adult-like intent, but also showing psychological deficits that suggested something deeply wrong in his development. He was sentenced to spend most of his life in prison, denied the normal milestones of youth and young adulthood, but preserved the theoretical possibility of eventual freedom if he could demonstrate sufficient change. Whether Tyler Bennett will ever leave prison, whether he will ever develop the capacity for genuine remorse and empathy, whether justice has been served by his sentence, these questions can only be answered by time. What remains certain is that on October 15, 2018, two people who had committed no crime beyond being imperfect parents
were murdered in their bed by their own son. And that act of violence sent ripples through families and communities that continue to be felt more than a decade later.